Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone online can hear me. Welcome. We're glad you all can join us this morning for the what is the postponed January USAID Adaptation Community Meeting. This one was obviously postponed because of the government shutdown, so we've rescheduled it for today. These ACM events, generally speaking, are on the third Thursday of each month. So this one is an anomaly in that sense. And then we'll have another one 2 weeks from today on Thursday, February 21st. This one is also an anomaly in the sense that it's in the morning and it's a webcast only. Normally, these are live events that we also webcast. And they normally are at 4 p.m., from 4 p.m. to 5:30 p.m., as I say, on Thursdays. So we hope that in the future, those who haven't joined us can join us either in person or online for the events that are coming up. But as for today, we will be hearing from Ashley Moran, who will be talking about, she'll be talking about fragility and climate change and how they are connected. And she will be introduced by Cynthia Brady from USAID in just a moment. But just a couple other logistics related to the ACMs before we get into the actual talk today. If you do not already receive announcements about the ACMs, you can sign up to receive them on the climatelinks.org website. And you will not only receive notifications about the upcoming ACM events, but you'll receive news about other documents that are posted to Climate Links, other events that USAID is sponsoring. So it's a good kind of central location for those who don't know about it for all things in the climate and resilience space at USAID. So I encourage those who are not already signed up to do so. Let's see, other housekeeping things before I turn things over to Cynthia. I guess I should have said at the outset, my name is Chris Perrine. I am the Atlas Project Chief of Party. Atlas is another USAID funded climate change adaptation program. And we host these events for USAID on a monthly basis. So with that, I will turn things over to Cynthia to introduce today's session and to introduce Ashley.
Great. Good morning, everybody. This is Cynthia Brady with USAID. I am currently sitting in the Center for Resilience in the Bureau for Food Security with USAID, but for a number of years, I have been with the Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation in the DACHA Bureau, and CMM is the office that supported the research that we're presenting to you today. But the objectives of the research also align really nicely with the work of the Center for Resilience. So it's fortuitous that I'm able to have both of those perspectives. And I appreciate the research from both of those lines of thinking. And I hope that all of you will find those same benefits. I will let Ashley actually say a little more specifically about her team. As you can see from the front slide, there's a great team of researchers who have been involved in this project over time. Ashley is presenting on behalf of all of them today. Ashley and many of the people up there are with the University of Texas, the Robert Strass Center, and CMM has been partnered with them in a number of ways intellectually for a long time, and then specifically on this partnership over the last couple of years. And we at USAID generally are so grateful for the work of the center. They have been so innovative, pushing forward the analytics around this space and increasingly connecting it to field practice, which is, of course, really helpful to USAID specifically, but the overall work has been very helpful to other parts of the US government as well. This particular research is an area of analysis that they, oh, sorry. Okay.
Yep.
All right. Looked like there was a technical glitch, sorry, to those online. The Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation, in partnership with other parts of AID, including the Climate Adaptation Team and the Africa Bureau and the Latin America Bureau, have been looking specifically at this nexus of climate change and conflict and fragility for a number of years. And this particular research represents an evolution of some of that earlier work as well as a complement to it. Our goal has always been simply at its core to better understand the relationship between the dynamics of climate change and conflict and fragility, and specifically governance in the middle of that. We have been seeking to really try from USAID's place of value add to support better understanding of risk pathways and the compound vulnerabilities that result. As we all know, the problems that we face in development are very complex, but unfortunately, many of the solution sets tend to be rather sectoral and siloed. Research like that we're presenting today will hopefully help us frame a more common narrative in a more cohesive and comprehensive way about those complex risks and capabilities that exist. Our premise is that if you don't get the risk assessment right, it's really hard to get the solutions right. So while this research is mostly focused on diagnostics, we really do hope that it's pointing us in directions of programmatic solutions on the other side of it. As many of you know, more than 60% historically of the countries where USAID works are classified as fragile or conflict affected. So that is the majority of places where USAID is working. And the majority of those places are also significantly affected by the impacts of climate change. When we look at the other side of that equation, in places where we have been making priority climate adaptation investments, well over 80% of those are also affected by conflict and or fragility. So it's a really significant overlap. And for us, the research that we're talking about today chose to focus on fragility specifically rather than necessarily violent conflict for a number of reasons. But part of it is fragility is really about the state-society relationship. It's about governance, not just government. And that feels very profound when you're trying to understand how all of these dynamic and emergent systems are interacting with one another, and where your opportunities are to influence those in terms of different kinds of institutions and different kinds of actors. And fragility hopefully helps us have that conversation more productively. Maybe one more thing to highlight. What we know is that when change outpaces the ability of institutions to respond, political problems often arise. So when we are trying to understand how to best approach climate adaptation, we want to bring this additional lens to that set of analytics. So we hope that this research gives us all a new set of tools to better assess risk and to really help us prioritize some of our responses. And with that introduction, I will turn it over to Ashley to present the research, and I will be here to help Ashley answer any questions or discuss any of these issues more fully after the presentation. Thank you. Over to you, Ashley.
Great. Thanks so much, Cynthia. How's my voice level coming through? Okay, everybody?
Yes, we can hear you well on our end, Ashley.
Perfect.
And then I'll mute our speakers so don't get any feedback.
So thanks so much. I'm so happy to be here and just to share more about this work. As you see on our slide here, we had a great team that came together as part of this study, and it's really an outgrowth of our work together over the last 10 years or so on projects that we had for the Defense Department looking at the security implications of climate change in key regions, first in Africa and then in Asia. So we really draw on a lot of our experience there in expanding this work globally and more focused on this intersection of climate and fragility risks. So to give you a sense of where I'll be heading in the presentation, the scope of our project, I should just start by saying that our goal was really to identify the states that face substantial climate risks and high fragility risks that may prevent them from being able to effectively address those climate risks. You know, the rationale being, of course, that places with compound fragility climate risks may be more vulnerable to humanitarian emergencies or instabilities. So having a really precise sense of the specific climate and fragility challenges that states face and where they face those within their borders can help identify focal points for intervention. So it's really important to note that this follows on a groundbreaking study commissioned by the G7 that developed a framework for thinking about compound fragility and climate risks. And as Cynthia noted, USAID then commissioned us to develop new measures to identify really where and how these risks intersect. So you all are very likely familiar with a prior quantitative and mapping work that has separately assessed fragility risks globally. Of course, we might think about the Fragile States Index, a State Fragility Index, and other efforts that have assessed individual climate risks globally, like UNEP grid work, and composite climate risks regionally through the work of my colleague Josh Busby. But ours is the first study now to integrate these quantitative and mapping efforts across climate and fragility globally. So I'll walk you through today these new measures that we developed in coordination with USAID. Particularly on the climate side, it captures multiple hazards. And this was really important for us because responding to even a single climate risk requires substantial resources, infrastructure, mobilization, and responding to multiple hazards, often concurrently or right on the heels of each other, requires these resources and mobilization many times over. So the second measure we developed is a global fragility measure that captures both state effectiveness and legitimacy in key spheres of state operations, political, security, economic, and social spheres. But importantly, it does not include environment in the fragility measure. Because if we want to be overlaying our fragility measure on our climate measures, we don't want to be capturing environmental risks twice. So I'll also walk you through the various ways we've captured this intersection of risks. We have different mapping portraits that I'll talk with you about, and then also some statistical analyses that identify what portions of state populations or territories face high and very high climate exposure. And these are done in GIS so that we have statistics that can be compared across countries to really allow us to dig deeper behind the maps. Okay, so one note also on each of our slides, I note at the bottom the names of the people on our team who led that data set and the raw data sources. So that you can find all of these data sets and the resulting maps and analyses on our website. And I include that link at the end of my presentation here. It's important to note that all of our data and maps and everything are all open source. So we hope that people will use them, and they're most definitely all available for people to use in whatever way they see fit. So on our climate measure, this was led by my colleague Josh Busby, expanding on the regional modeling that his team did on our Defense Department projects focused on Africa and Asia. And it's a subnational measure, which is really important at getting at exactly where within countries climate risks are coming together. And it's a measure of chronic exposure to multiple overlapping climate hazards. And so this is a list of the 6 hazards captured by this measure. And it tracks historical exposure for the most recent and the broadest set of years available with global coverage. So in doing so, it allows us to see not only the specific risks that countries and locations within countries face, but also their accumulated exposure to multiple hazards. So just to have a quick look at each of these 6 individual indicators. The first here is cyclones. Second one is floods, and of course, it looks like very small areas susceptible to heavy flooding at this global scale, but of course, when we zoom in, we see detailed flood risk, and I'll show you a zoomed in portrait in just a moment. Next, wildfires, rainfall anomalies, which is one of the 2 measures for rainfall risks captured in this measure. So this particular one captures chronic long-term drought, where rainfall is lower than historical averages. The second one captures chronic aridity, which would capture things like chronic water scarcity in Yemen and other places facing such risks. Low elevation coastal zones aims to capture places that are susceptible not only to storm surges now, but also future sea level rise and coastal inundation. And then together, they provide us this portrait of where these 6 really diverse hazards are coming together to present substantial climate risks to populations and locations. So this provides us with a country level look at how these risks come together. And so we can see, for example, here in Nigeria, chronic aridity and flooding in the north, along with wildfires in the far northwest, decreased rainfall and wildfires and flooding across the middle belt, and heavy flooding due to both coastal inundation and riverine flooding. Also wildfires, decreased rainfall, all coming together there in the densely populated south. So just an example here of how we can use these various climate risks to look at how risks vary and also coalesce within a country. So before I go on to the compound risks, I want to note several findings about places with the highest overall climate exposure worldwide, as some of these places do show up as having high compound risks and some do not. So for example, in these top 15 countries or territories with the largest shares of their population in very high exposure areas, some like the Netherlands on this list are not fragile. So they're not going to show up in our compound risks. Others, like small, low-lying island nations like the Maldives, Marshall Islands, Kiribati, have population numbers that are low enough that they don't hit the threshold for countries' tracked and indicators used to create our fragility measures. So it's important to look at these because they are also facing high climate risks, even though they don't show up in our compound risks. So they're facing really high shares of their population in very high climate exposure areas. So this next table on countries or territories with the largest population numbers in high exposure areas uncovers some states like China and the United States that have really large population numbers in highly exposed areas, highlighting that while these states are less fragile, they, some of the richest countries in the world face substantial climate challenges. Okay, so moving on to the second component of our analysis, the fragility risks. So this is a country level measure where overall fragility is the sum of scores on a range of effectiveness scores and legitimacy scores. And so on the effectiveness side, this aims to capture the capacity of public sector institutions and practices. On the legitimacy side, it assesses the degree of direct or indirect public support for those government institutions and officials and practices. So each state receives both a fragility score and then a classification in one of 5 categories. And importantly, our structure that we are showing you here aligns with USAID's internal measures and framework for assessing fragility, so that it can correlate with their framework and talking with partners and others externally. So it differs, though, from other global fragility measures you might see, as I mentioned, like the Fragile States Index, in that ours does track both effectiveness and legitimacy sides of the equation, and it doesn't include environmental indicators and uses all open source data. So it does provide sort of a new look at some of these fragility issues. And when we look at overall fragility globally, we see that the highest levels of fragility are concentrated across sub-Saharan Africa and across Southern Asia, from the Middle East through South and Southeast Asia. And I want to highlight just 3 key points about fragility specifically that came out of our research that are important as we think about compound fragility climate risks. And the first one is that across all levels of fragility, so from the lowest up to the highest, countries have, on average, larger deficits in legitimacy than in capacity. So what this means is that poor state legitimacy, reflecting public perceptions that the state is either unwilling or unable to meet public needs, contributes more to the fragility of states on average than poor state effectiveness does. That's not to say, of course, that there aren't capacity deficits in fragile states, but that legitimacy deficits are exceeding those on average. The second key fragility finding I'll highlight here is that in today's fragile states, average legitimacy deficits have been worsening over our 15-year study period from 2000 to 2014. But this has not been happening in states that today have low fragility at the bottom of this, the bottom white line there. And thirdly, in states in the highest fragility category today, so the top white line there, effectiveness deficits have also been worsening over these 15 years, and that's not seen in any other fragility category. So moving into what we learned about the intersection of these high climate and fragility risks, the first takeaway in this analysis is the regional concentrations of compound risks. So we see that the highest combined fragility and climate risks are in sub-Saharan Africa, followed by the Middle East and North Africa, South and Southeast Asia. And so this map is one way to identify these concentrations of fragility and climate risks. It's a bivariate map that integrates the data from fragility and climate before mapping. The challenge with this is that it does lose some of the granularity in the climate data because the aggregation process before mapping, we are required to sort of aggregate the climate data up to a higher geographic level. So we developed another set of maps that allow us to see at subnational, really fine-grained climate data for specific fragility categories. So in this case, this is highlighting the countries that are in the highest fragility level. And so these overlay maps have this detailed subnational climate data as the base layer, and then we applied a semi-transparent layer to all countries except those in the one fragility category we wanted to look at. So we have these for every fragility category. So this is just another example of resources that are available if it's of use in your work. The second key takeaway from analyzing compound risks is that, as I note here, the majority of highly fragile states have more than 1 million people and more than 10% of the population in high exposure areas. This ties in with what Cynthia was saying, that the majority of states where they're working are facing both fragility risks and climate risks, right? So, and when we refer to highly fragile states here, I'm referring to states that are in our highest and high fragility levels, so the two highest fragility levels on our measure. So the left side of the table here, in terms of having large numbers of people exposed, there are 21 highly fragile states that have more than 1 million people living in high climate exposure areas. So this is just a list of the top ones there. But there are particularly high population risks in places like India. There are like more than 118 million people living in high climate exposure areas. Nigeria with more than 41 million. On the right side of the table there, many states also have a large share of their population facing high exposure. So there are 21 states, which is a slightly different list from those on the left-hand side of the table. There are 21 states that have more than 10% of their population living in high exposure areas. And this is a list of the top 8 that have more than 25%. You'll see Sierra Leone stands out with fully 100% of its population living in high exposure areas. Other states like Guinea, 64%. So these states are really grappling with substantial population exposure to climate risks. The third takeaway from analyzing compound risks is that most highly fragile states face multiple overlapping climate hazards. Indeed, this is what our climate measure sought to capture, given the extreme challenge this poses for fragile states and the resources and infrastructure and mobilization required to respond to that single hazard and multiple hazards. But we do want to highlight that there are several highly fragile states that face such high exposure to a single hazard that it risks exceeding the state's capacity to respond. So places like Yemen, Mali, Niger, Republic of the Congo face really high chronic aridity that exceeds or has the potential to exceed state capacity to respond. The fourth takeaway from analyzing compound risks is, as I noted before, that state legitimacy is poor in nearly all states with high compound fragility climate risks. And it's important to note that this is a trend we saw across all fragile states, but that it's even more pronounced in states with high compound fragility and climate risks. So since fragility in these states is composed more of deficits in state legitimacy, state actions that respond to public needs for reducing climate vulnerabilities have the potential to simultaneously reduce both those climate risks and the legitimacy deficits that contribute to fragility in these countries. The final takeaway I'll highlight here in analyzing compound risks is that fragility is really key in exploring these indirect pathways between climate risks and potential conflict outcomes. So in states with similarly high compound fragility climate risks, we see very different outcomes. So on the left here, we see different conflict patterns, even in states with similar climate stressors and similar levels of political violence. For example, across the Sahel in Ethiopia, there's rebel conflict and conflict around land planning. In Sudan, anti-state conflict and elite conflict. Chad is really grappling with overflow conflict. Mali has accumulated challenges from Islamist pressures, secessionist elite, civil society pressures, while Niger has really managed to keep much of its the most really radical and volatile elements of its politics under control, even while its neighbors are in active conflict. So we just want to really highlight that this really underscores the role of governance in shaping conflict outcomes. The second group of countries here in the middle is that we see more civic or social conflict, like riots and protests, in areas where the state has the capacity to respond. So, for example, in a country like India. And the high rate of these types of conflict can suggest that the basis for positive state-society relationships is present, but mechanisms for communication and reform really require further support. And the third type of countries that we'll that we'll highlight here on the right is countries that are experiencing multiple ongoing long-term conflicts. And the persistence of these multiple parallel conflicts in areas where state capacity and legitimacy are low is seen in countries like DRC, Nigeria, Pakistan, Sudan, and the state's failure to reduce the violence that persists here really suggests that national institutions are too weak to address the key political, economic, and social issues that lead to conflict. So our point that we really wanted to make with this slide and this finding is that considering the dynamics of state effectiveness and legitimacy can help us identify how climate vulnerability can be compounded by a government's inability to manage climate risks and the follow-on social and economic processes that can lead to conflict. But it can also highlight how resilience efforts can target many of these challenges simultaneously, right? So resilience efforts can simultaneously benefit climate, conflict, and environmental programming goals, which, in countries that are facing these challenges simultaneously as well. So I'll highlight three opportunities for intervention or support to three different types of countries that we saw. The first is highly fragile states that have both a large number of people and a large share of the population and a sizable portion of territory facing high or very high climate exposure. So these are countries where climate places extreme stress on both the population and territory of these states, which could limit livelihood choices, place additional requirements on already fragile states, and really require substantial investments to address these combined risks. So our thinking, though, is that the large number of people affected could draw international investments, and the large percentage of people affected could draw domestic political will to respond. So there is a potential alignment of international and domestic interests there, and an opportunity to leverage new finance. So the second group of countries are those highly fragile states, again, that have either a large number of people or a large portion of the population in very high climate exposure areas, concentrated in very small portions of the state. So the concentrated nature of this very high population risk could be an opportunity to prioritize targeted interventions that address specific climate risks affecting a large population in a very small area. And so just to highlight Colombia as an example of this, and we have a country brief on that goes into a little more detail. And so on our website, you can consult that for further resources. The third group of countries are those that are today moderately fragile, and or in recent years have been moderately fragile and are facing very high climate exposure. So these countries could be a focal point for preventing the onset of new compound risks. So the focus here would be on shoring up state capacity to ensure that these moderately fragile states have the capacity to address the very high climate risks they face. So while they're not facing high fragility, yet the climate hazards place such extreme stress on these states in terms of both the population and land area exposed, fragility worsens, and these states are not able to effectively address their climate risks. Large numbers of people could become more vulnerable to the very high climate risks they face. So I'll close here with some thinking about opportunities for using these data and maps in planning work with partner countries. Our hope is that compound fragility climate risk assessment can help in several ways. First, pretty simply, as I've already gone through, helping to identify focal points for intervention where high compound fragility climate risks may exceed the state's capacity to respond. Secondly, supporting early action to prevent the emergence of new compound risks by shoring up that capacity of the moderately fragile states, as I noted, that already face very high climate risks. And thirdly, in supporting policy coordination. So we've certainly seen more military and aid interventions in fragile states that are experiencing localized conflict, political upheaval, or humanitarian crises. Many of these states also face very high climate risks that can exacerbate these underlying issues or complicate responses. So, as a case in point, of the 26 countries that we identified as today having highest compound fragility climate risks, the UN has peace operations in 20 of them. The US military has troops deployed in all but 4. And the US government has provided nearly $100 billion in aid in the security, humanitarian, and development areas over the last 10 years. The OECD has called for greater policy coordination in fragile states. This is certainly something that many agencies and governments are working towards. So our hope is that knowing the specific ways that fragility and climate risks intersect can be of support to this process and can be a resource for policymakers. So fourthly, and relatedly, this analysis of compound risks and these data can help us broaden strategies for reducing fragility. So looking at fragility and climate together allows us to see how climate vulnerability can be compounded by fragility, but also, as I noted, where resilience initiatives can impact both climate and fragility challenges. So for example, in these states that have really high legitimacy deficits, contributing substantially to fragility, efforts to address the climate risks that those populations are facing can help reduce both those climate risks and the legitimacy deficits that are contributing to fragility. And lastly here, analyzing compound risks and help identify the best channels for climate actions in fragile states. So looking at fragility and climate together allows us to see how climate policies may be best implemented in a given state, particularly at least in the initial stages, right? So on the one hand, knowing the specific sectors where a state is experiencing fragility can help in designing robust climate policies that won't be undermined by a lack of state capacity in related spheres. And on the other hand, the positive side of that, the strongest facets of governance in a state, whether that's in the political or economic or social or security sphere, can present an opportunity for action to reduce climate risks by directing reforms through that sphere. And we talk about this a little bit in our country briefs that we have on Colombia, Nigeria, and Bangladesh. So we can talk about that a little bit more in the Q&A, or we have additional resources you guys can find on our website. So I'll close with that and direct everybody to this website here that has the raw data sources I mentioned, all of the maps and the reports and country briefs, and just open it up for conversation here now.
Great. Thank you so much, Ashley. That was wonderful. We have a few questions that have come through online and can direct those to both you and Cynthia. And for those that are on the line and have questions, feel free to send them as they come up. We have ample time to address, as many questions as we can get to. So if you type question, you should be able to insert a question at the bottom of the screen, and that will come through to us as hosts. Great. So one of the first questions that we received was from someone in the audience, Lori Krieger, and she asked, wondering why the percentage of parliamentary seats held by women was used and maternal mortality ratio was not used for social. And Ashley,
Yeah.
if you would be.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, we, of course, had to juggle a bit as to which indicators to include. We felt that the percentage of women included in parliament is really important to provide a representation for efforts towards gender equality and gender representation in the country, which can be such an important component of societal resilience. And so that's why we included that indicator.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we have another one from Joan Norville. For the Caribbean, it is difficult to see if the color for fragility or climate exposure is low, which in my opinion is not the case, or was, in that there is little or no data.
It's a combination. So you will see that there are some countries that are, like the Cayman Islands, for example, that are below the population threshold for being able to track the underlying fragility indicators. So some of those are not included in fragility data. We do, and thus aren't represented in the compound risks section. We do highlight this in our overarching global report, where we're able to dig into the data a bit more and really highlight those countries that aren't showing up on the compound list that we think should be showing up on a compound list of risks. And so that's 2 points there. So one, on the statistical side, that's included in our global report to highlight, which countries have climate risks and or fragility risks, but aren't showing up on our list of compound risks. And then secondly, on the mapping side, if you pull down our maps from our website, you can really zoom in quite a bit more to be able to see these smaller countries that just don't show up at the global scale. But the data are there on our maps. So they are visible if you pull up the maps and sort of zoom in a bit more. So in both of those ways, we sought to tackle these smaller countries that just don't show up either physically on a map or for other data-driven reasons. So.
Great, thank you. I have a question from Casey Harrison, and I think this is good for Cynthia, but also feel free to add Ashley. And the question is, will this compound risk assessment and the recommendations for different investment groups be mainstreamed through USAID in 2019? And what are the next steps for the findings from these assessments and the tool itself?
That is a great question. I'm not certain how to answer what it means to be mainstreamed. Since this research I think of it really as helping us to raise red flags so that we can pay better attention to where there are, first of all, heightened risks that maybe we hadn't noticed from one sectoral lane or another. And secondarily, it allows us, as Ashley was just saying, using the particular tools developed by this research to kind of zero in on better data for specific countries. So I think that the likelihood is that this particular research could be picked up sectorally by, for example, those working on climate adaptation programs in a specific country, or it could be picked up by missions who are working on a range of programs that are affected by the context of fragility as well as the context of climate exposure, and to maybe think about some of the programs and areas where they're working in the country a little bit differently. So the goal is certainly to get this research into the hands of as many practitioners in aid as possible across those different geographic and sectoral spaces. But what the people sitting in those places are positioned to do with it will look different depending on where they are and whether the focus will be more at a policy conversation level or a program design level or somewhere in between.
And it looks like
Casey's question. Did I answer the whole thing?
Oh, yeah. I was just going to say, it looks like they specified by mainstreamed, what was meant was funding opportunities for those working on adaptation programs. But I can go back to the question as well.
I would be happy to share that question with some of our participants in the webinar. There are a few folks from the climate adaptation team who are here. If they have any insights or comment regarding funding plans, please feel free to chime in. From the perspective of where I sit formerly in the Dacha Bureau in the Climate Office, we do not program funding around climate adaptation specifically, so no. And also from the Resilience Center, I don't know, there are actually folks from the Resilience Center on the line too, if they want to speak to any complementarities that they see between funding plans for resilience programs and some of these findings. We are welcome to chime in as well.
Great. And just one note, I think, for participants, you don't have speaking rights, but you can feel free to add any comments and we can read that out on your behalf if you wanted to address what Cynthia mentioned.
Talk about a circuitous conversation.
So we will go on to another question. Let's see. We have a question from John Wickham. So the question was if the presenter, so Ashley, if you could repeat what you meant by focal points for intervention. Are these government agencies and representatives, or are they ecological or natural resource sectors?
Oh, I see what you mean. Okay, well, what we were thinking about in using that particular phrasing is just providing new data on where exactly climate and fragility risks are intersecting, both physically within a country in terms of the climate risks, how they're distributed across a country, but then where those are intersecting with government and societal risks in terms of fragility and where governments and societies may have more or less capacity to address those climate risks. So looking at the intersection of those two climate risks, we were thinking that those are identifying focal points in that sense for intervention or support to those governments and societies trying to respond to those climate risks. Does that answer the question?
Great. Thank you. Okay, I'm just going through others. Yes, that did answer the question. They confirmed. Thank you.
Okay.
Another question we have from the audience is from Emmett Boyer. Thank you so much for your presentation, Ashley. I wanted to know if there were any surprises for you in the outcomes of this research.
So one thing that surprised me initially was a place like Yemen not showing up as highly as facing high climate risks on our measure, which is why we ended up including this focus in the findings of these countries that are not showing up on the compound measure, but face exceedingly high exposure to a single climate risk. So a country like Yemen didn't show up on our overall measure of climate exposure because we designed, and when I say we, that's definitely the royal we, my colleagues designed the climate measure as a way of capturing multiple risks, right? As I noted, because the need is to assess countries that are facing really substantial challenges to many climate risks that could exceed their capacity to build that infrastructure and that response capacity. So a country like Yemen, though, faces exceedingly high climate exposure to just really chronic aridity and water scarcity. So we really wanted to draw that out because that was a bit of a surprise to us. We, of course, follow Yemen closely, and we're aware of both the climate and fragility challenges that the country faces, and so to have it not show up on the compound risk list was a surprise. And so we wanted to highlight countries like Yemen, like Republic of the Congo, Niger, that face really high exposure to just a single climate hazard, but it's so high that it really risks and has already, in some of those cases, exceeded the state's capacity to address it.
Great. Thank you, Ashley. To jump down, we have a comment also from Andre Andre Marchand from the perspective of the Center for Resilience, and he noted that we already have resilience programs in several of the countries highlighted, such as Mali, Niger, and Uganda. So thank you so much, Andre, for specifying that. Great. Okay, bear with me, everyone. So we have another question from Hassan Baraji. What key principles should development assistance agencies adopt to not contribute to climate fragility risks? So Cynthia or Ashley, feel free.
I'll take a first crack at that with a really clear lesson, which is that when we are doing our context or problem assessments, it is incredibly important that we bring both of these lanes of analysis to that narrative. They overlap in incredibly important ways, and they interact with one another in a huge number of places where we're operating. So we do a real disservice to our attempts at making things better if we're missing part of the equation. So a really simple answer with a very complicated chain of execution is to make sure that we're really addressing both of these issues in our analytic frameworks. Because if you don't get that problem assessment as comprehensive as possible, you're not going to understand the system, nor will you understand the influence that you're having in it as effectively as you can. And I think these findings help us see that in some country-specific ways. So that would be my...
Yeah, great. I don't know, Ashley, if you had anything you wanted to add.
Yeah, you bet. I would make 2 points. And the first is definitely to affirm what Cynthia is saying there about the value of looking at these two components together, climate and fragility risks. You're looking at a country like Nigeria, for example, that faces very high fragility, ongoing conflicts, and both of these limit the state's capacity to respond to its climate challenges. And at the same time, environmental stress and government mismanagement of that stress and other stressors may be increasing the severity of land conflicts and food shortages. And you see this unfolding in different ways in different parts of the country, but you do see a common connection between climate and fragility risks overlapping and intersecting in these distinct instabilities that Nigeria is facing in the north, in the Middle Belt, in the Niger Delta. So looking at how climate risks and fragility risks are intersecting in unique ways in each location within a country that's experiencing these kind of instabilities, I think, and climate challenges and fragility challenges can help really pinpoint where interventions may be most successful and how they can address these risks together. The second point I would highlight is the value of looking at both the legitimacy and effectiveness sides of the fragility equation. And certainly USAID has been a leader in this, both within the US government and globally. And just to underscore the importance of that, this came out in our findings with seeing how heavily, of course, both sides of this equation contribute to fragility, but particularly how legitimacy is declining more precipitously in countries that face these compound fragility and climate risks. And it makes sense, right? I think if the public is seeing that their government doesn't have the capacity or the will to meet their needs and the very real vulnerabilities they're facing from climate change, the legitimacy of that government in the eyes of its society can decline quickly. But this identifies, I think, some opportunities for interventions that keep these two sides of the fragility equation in mind and can look at where the government is facing capacity or legitimacy deficits, because those might differ in different spheres. To go back to Colombia, it has really strong capacity in some areas, particularly the economic side, particularly the political side, and really high legitimacy deficits in others. And so thinking about how these two sides of the state-society relationship are working within a country, I think can provide new tools for not only addressing those challenges, but also thinking about how to address fragility and climate risk together.
Great. Can I actually just emphasize, I think a point out of Ashley's remarks is the importance of focusing on prevention. There are so many opportunities to do better with prevention when we can see that the changes are not just on the horizon, they're happening. And there are lots of different, again, picking up from Ashley's points, right? The problems are not universal across countries in terms of climate exposure or in terms of fragility risks. So there are often opportunities to help build resilience and move things or shift things in a positive direction before they shift the other way on their own. So I think that focus on prevention is another really helpful lesson that we can draw from this research.
Excellent. Yeah, really great point.
We have another question from Che Mo, who is his question about the Sahel. So in the Sahel, he agrees with kind of the origin of the fragility as presented, but his question is whether or not the research took into account the regional geopolitics and regional factors when looking at country fragility, in addition to some of the internal factors that contribute to it.
Oh, I see what you mean. Not in the fragility measure itself, because it is a country level measure. So on the governance side, we were looking at indicators of government capacity and legitimacy in these various spheres. And so those were all national level indicators and levels of analysis. And on the societal side, similarly, looking at the capacity, the resilience of society, and Those, again, were all national level indicators. The only one that starts to take in some international dimensions are asylum requests, and thinking about, when people no longer have enough faith in their government to keep them safe, that they feel they need to apply for asylum in another country. We used that as an indicator of the government's legitimacy, but that it really doesn't get to what you're raising here about the regional dynamics that come into play. That, I think, is a really key thing. It would be lovely to include it in the measure somehow, but it's complicated, I think, by trying to translate it to a national level measure. But I think that your point is really important in the subsequent analysis and thinking about, okay, what are these subnational climate measures plus national level fragility measures mean for a country that's grappling with it? Because then we can analyze, how that fits within the broader regional pressures that countries are, or bonuses in some cases that countries are also facing.
I would also just add on to that a recommendation to take a look at the 3 country case studies that accompany the global report. I think those offer, while they are limited, it is only 3 countries, Colombia, Nigeria, and Bangladesh. They do offer a helpful way to provide a broader context to those national focused analytics.
Great.
And our hope would be that other countries could use the global in the same way to help them parse out more local context dynamics better.
Excellent. And those would be found, through the link that should be on everyone's screen. Just as a reminder, the StraussCenter.org has these resources that both Cynthia and Ashley have referenced a few times. So we have a few more questions. I'll turn now to one from Rose Schneider. She said, I appreciated the discussion on opportunities. You mentioned the large organizations. Do you have information on NGOs playing a role in channels of climate action?
I'm not sure. Is that for me or Cynthia? I'm not thinking of when I mentioned large organizations. So I just want to be sure I get to the right spot.
No, you're great. I don't this moment. We can come back to that one as well.
I don't know if this is a useful answer to that, Rose, but one suggestion that jumps to my mind is to take a look at the website for an organization called the Climate, actually, Ashley, help me. What is the name of your, see it? The Climate and Security Working Group. What is the name? Is it Climate Security?
The Center, Center for Climate and Security.
They have a really helpful website that also has a lot of links to other organizations that are working in this shared space. And I'm not sure whether this was really the heart of your question, but if it is, that might be a great resource for you to see some of the more climate-focused organizations that are also working or leaning in the direction of the national security space. Might be a helpful resource.
Great. Thanks so much, Cynthia. So now we have a question from Clive Matanga. Did the analysis attempt to look into the future or, to project how the climate and fragility will intersect in the future vis-a-vis the drivers?
So the short answer is it did not. All of our data are capturing the most recent long-term historical trends for which data are available both on the climate side and the fragility side. I think the natural next step in this research, or what others could do with it as well, is integrating these levels of analysis that we did with historical data on the climate challenges, the chronic climate challenges places have faced, and their current capacity to address those or not, and integrating that with data that's available on future trends that are expected. For example, in population growth, right? In migration and population movements, across borders, in future projections of climate changes and hazards that places are expected to see. So all of these things could be integrated with this analysis of the challenges that countries are currently facing to provide a really great picture, I think, of their current vulnerability based on both historical and present challenges and expected future challenges in many of these areas. We did not have the opportunity to get into that latter part, but hope that it will be done by somebody.
Great. Thank you. So we have a question from Celine Meyer. Are there any case studies or illustrations of countries that have high compound risks where there are examples of successful USAID interventions that work toward addressing both issues?
Yes.
Cynthia, you want to go? Okay.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, I think that's a question for Cynthia.
Oh. Well, thank you for that, Ashley. Yes, so as I mentioned in my opening remarks, the Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation has partnered with other parts of the agency for a number of years to do research and analytics and programming in this space. So we do have some lessons, and we also have some written products that can be easily found and shared. So USAID supported a number of country-based case studies over time. I believe there are 14 of them now. And I would really hope that they're all in an easily findable, searchable place on USAID's website, but I know that they're not. So the easiest thing to do, there were a number of case studies done the majority of them were done in Africa, but there was a case study in Peru. There have been, I think, 3 or 4 different case studies in the Asia region. So if you just Google USAID, climate change and conflict case studies, you should come up with a number of those resources, but they're hosted on a variety of different sites. I don't know. I'll talk with the Atlas team here to see if maybe there's a way I could share links with the folks involved in this webinar if that's of interest to you. But yes, there are, that was a long-winded way of saying, sorry, that there have been a number of country-based case studies which looked at these dynamics, and also in most of those cases, I think all of them, looked at ongoing USAID programs that were interacting with some of those dynamics and provided some highlights of where there was positive deviance and positive outcomes from what would have been expected, even when addressing the specific nexus of climate and fragility or conflict hadn't been the goal of the program, so that we were pulling out programmatic approaches that were helpful lessons. And then in addition to that, the DACHA Bureau has recently supported a number of evaluations of programs that were working on issues of climate change adaptation and peace building. There are reports from Sudan and from Kenya and Ethiopia. And Chris is nodding at me, and what I'm wondering is, are those publicly available?
Yeah, so at this point, the one for the Karamoja region, that straddles Uganda and Kenya, that one is available. And the one for Ethiopia is available. The one for Sudan is in process now and should be available in the next couple of months by the time we get it finalized and approved.
Yeah. So all of that is I would really commend those evaluations to you that Chris just referenced, because I think they do an excellent job of answering the question you raised, which is kind of, what do we know programmatically so far about where some effective strategies and approaches lie, and where did we get some things wrong that we wouldn't want to repeat? And those are really great evaluations.
Just one more quick comment on that. I mean, one clear observation from Alice having done those assessments is that, as is the case with a lot of the work we do in the development sector, having good evidence at the outset, good baseline information is really important. So in these particular instances, understanding, for example, the climate risks, and then programming based on those identified climate risks is really important to obviously doing effective interventions that ultimately will dial down the temperature on existing conflicts in the areas that are being targeted. Seems obvious, but something that sometimes is taken for granted.
Excellent. Wonderful. And the reports that that Chris mentioned earlier are available on climatelinks.org, so you can find those publicly available. Rose asked again for the links that you mentioned, which we can post afterwards on a follow-up. Yeah, we can post those with the recording of the webinar. We can post those links in an associated post through Climate Links as well.
That's a great suggestion.
Yeah, wonderful. Okay, I think I have one or two more questions here. So we had another question from Lori Krieger. Are you aware of any analysis that has also taken into account political and military pressures on the country from other countries, for example, Yemen?
I haven't seen that, but I'd be very interested if that is out there. So if others know, please let me know.
Yeah, fair point. Okay, and then I think that is all of the questions that have come through on my end. I know there's still folks online who may have other things. So if you have any questions that went unanswered or you haven't had a chance to send a question, please feel free to send it through now. We do have a few more moments. But I think that we've gotten a chance to address all the questions that came through online. But like I said, if I missed anything, go ahead and send it again.
Can I jump in real quick?
Please do.
Yeah, I would just say, my email here, my colleagues' emails are up here. Please shoot us an email if you can't find something you're looking for on our site or in the data. I'm so happy to field any follow-up questions by email or data questions. As they come up, we definitely want these resources to be as useful as possible and applied. So as anything comes up in the short term or in the future, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Wonderful. Great, Ashley. Okay, let me just go back to questions to see if anything else came through. I just switch the way that it appears. Okay, great. So I don't see any new questions coming through, so I just wanted to thank you both. Especially thank you to Ashley and Cynthia for joining us today. Ashley, for your great presentation. Cynthia, for joining us from USAID and helping address these questions, and for a great introduction. This has been a really interesting topic and fruitful discussion afterwards, and I look forward to learning more about it through the resources online. We're also grateful for everybody who joined us online this morning. We've had over 50 participants, so thank you all for taking the time out of your mornings to listen in and join this discussion and learn a bit more about this topic. It's been really interesting. As a follow-up to this, we will be posting the recording of the webinar online through climatelinks.org. So as Chris mentioned at the beginning, that's also the best way to continue to receive notifications should you be interested in future adaptation community meetings. And we will post both the recording of this session as well as the presentation itself. And then we'll also make sure to link the resources that have been referenced in this conversation. So both those that you see through the Strauss Center online, but also the other reports that came up in our discussion. So thank you all once again. It's been wonderful having all of you on the line and sharing this conversation together. And just as a final reminder, our next adaptation community meeting will be on February 21st. As Chris mentioned at the beginning, this is an anomaly that we have 2 this month, but we're looking forward to delving into a new topic in 2 weeks, and that one will be at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, in person, as well as webinar for those that aren't able to join us in Washington, D.C. So great. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Ashley.